I think this stuff is coming at us, solar geo, much, much faster than most people realize. Like, I think there's probably some major decisions that are going to get started to be made in the next few years. And the public has no clue. And if they do, they think they're talking about chemtrails, right? I mean, like, nobody really has any idea about this. And so my role now really was to, as in my thinking, is like, I need to make a film that will get people to grapple with the reality of climate change and then start to think about decisions based on that.
Hello and welcome to the Inevitable and Obvious podcast. I'm Paul Gamble, and here I am with Ben Kalina. And I'm really looking forward to this conversation with you, Ben. We've chatted a few times before, more than a few times at this point. I think we have a lot of interests in common. Ben is a filmmaker, documentarian, a professor at Drexel University, and the filmmaker behind what is right now the only film out there covering climate interventions, but specifically the stratospheric aerosol injection. It's called Plan C for Civilization. I got to see it last fall. I really learned a lot. We're going to talk about that today, and so I'll turn it over to you, Ben. Tell us what's your film about.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, Paul. Thanks for having me on. It is kind of funny. I guess it's a good thing to have the only film in a topic area, but it's also, it's like, it's the best film out there about solar geoengineering. I think you can say that without any hesitation when I would normally not make such claims. This is a story that, I guess if it says anything, it was one that took 15 years to make, more or less, from the first time I picked up a camera. And it's really the story of the emergence of solar geoengineering from, essentially like an idea that scientists, researchers, policy people have batted around since the 1960s, and which has mostly been confined to science conferences and papers and thought pieces. And followed that whole kind of line of exploration out of those realms of the intellectual, and in a little bit dipping its toes into the real world. And that's what the film follows. That's what I was really interested in. And that's why it took so long to make, because it was a very slow evolving story and field of science that now is moving really quickly, but took a long time for it to kind of emerge from just people talking, basically.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit more about what do you cover in the film? What story were you trying to tell?
Yeah. So, there's the stories that I tried to tell. This was something that I felt was going to be really important. All the way back in like 2009-ish when I first started hearing about it. And, that was all the way back when.
Which is super early. Like that, I will say that was when I watched it. You had footage of some of those meetings back then. And like you were describing how David Keith and Ken Caldeira were sitting in the back room of this presentation. And I've read about that meeting multiple times in different books. And then to see that you had footage, and then at first I thought, well, that's interesting. Like, I wonder how there was footage. And then I talked to you, and it turns out that you were there and you were already interested in that stuff, right?
Well, that meeting I was not there for, just to be clear. That was at the Aspen Institute conference back in 1998, I think. So no, I was still in college. But I found that we found that footage, in other ways. But no, I the earliest stuff I shot was in 2010 at the Asilomar conference. And I actually got to meet David Keith back then, who became the central figure in the film. And that was really still very early in the process. And we did a quick little interview. I tried to find a way to squeeze a moment from that into the film, but it just didn't quite fit. So, it was really like you said, though, I mean, this is something that meeting that you referred to, which we do kind of document in the film, was an important moment when David and Ken Caldeira heard, a talk given by Edward Teller, or sorry, did I just mix their names up? Uh, no, not Edward Teller.
Yeah, it wasn't
Anyway,
Teller.
his sort of protege, whose name I'm spacing right now. Anyhow, he gave this Lowell Wood, gave this talk that was kind of full of braggadocio, saying we could cool the planet, give it Mediterranean temperatures. Ken and David were there, and that was when David, kind of who became the protagonist, first got interested, and they thought it was ridiculous. They went back to their labs and tried to prove that it was ridiculous, and as it turns out, it wasn't as ridiculous as they thought it was. And that's, I think, what really got both of them kind of thinking about this and focused on it. And so, David really had this profile, starting all the way back in the early 2000s, as, really being one of the most outspoken researchers in this field. Somebody who is not afraid to talk about the need to do research on this and to explore it. It's always been and still remains a pretty controversial topic and subject. A lot of people think that even just talking about it will diminish the energy to cut emissions. David, just, I think, understandably, as a researcher and scientist, wanted to understand it better and didn't want to get kind of distracted by other concerns. And so, I and other people have always he stood out from other researchers in that way, unafraid to kind of dip his toes into some pretty choppy waters. And back when I met him in 2010, that was already his reputation back at that conference at Asilomar. And so I was drawn to him and curious about what he had in mind and what he was thinking. But it took another 5 years really before he was back at Harvard again after doing his postdoc there as a faculty member, and announced with Frank Koich that they were going to do this experiment called SCoPEx. And SCoPEx stands for the Stratospheric Controlled Perturbarance Experiment. It's a real mouthful. It was, and David, honestly, and I have kind of butted heads, debated then and now still whether or not that experiment really warranted the sort of profile that it has in the film. He always has described it as a very small experiment, and it is. But what's important about it, and what I see in it, is that it's very symbolic, because it was, as I said, an idea that had really just been confined to conversation at that point. And there had been other failed attempts to do experiments like the SPICE project in London. But this was they were saying, we're going to do an experiment in the stratosphere. And that experiment has to do with solar geoengineering. And that's what made it, to me, really important, because it's really symbolically saying it's okay to do this and to move this research forward. And so even though the experiment itself was tiny and really insignificant, what was important, honestly, was that it came in the context of talking about solar geoengineering. And I think David's aware of that. I mean, they could have called it anything else. They could have not used the term solar geoengineering. Frank didn't come at this as someone who was some sort of advocate for solar geoengineering, and neither is David, although that's maybe changed a little bit. But he's an atmospheric chemist. They could have called it a background atmospheric chemistry experiment, and no one would have noticed, right? But calling it a solar geoengineering experiment, that's to me what really drew me to it and made me think, okay, this is something, because we're going to see people react to this in the world. We're going to see what goes on when you try to do an experiment like this and you call it solar geoengineering. And I just, you just kind of understood as a storyteller that people are going to come up and oppose this. Maybe some people will support it. They're going to have to figure out how to make this happen and how to talk about it with people. And so it really, I'm terrible with the metaphors, but it's like a trial balloon, right? I mean, that was what, and so that's when I kind of committed. Okay, this is the thing. We can drive a story with this. And then along the way, sort of at the 11th hour, came Luke and Andrew of Make Sunsets. So we followed this very serious scientist and the people around him and this debate, and we followed them all around the world for about 8 years. And then right towards the end, you get this entrance of these kind of unabashedly tech bro, move fast and break things attitude. A couple guys who started a for-profit company, just saying basically like, no more trials, no more experiments. Let's start doing this, and allowing people to basically pay a subscription for them to launch sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, or at least in their case towards the stratosphere. Whether or not it actually ended up there is a whole other question.
Yeah, I first saw the film. I watched it while I was in Helsinki last fall because I was attending Operatio Arctis was hosting their Atlas 25 conference, which was supposed to be, the purpose of it was to try to bring more Finnish and European civil society members, legislators, and that sort of thing together to understand better the risks. And David was there and was up on stage and kind of discussing this, and there were questions from the audience about the SCoPEx trial and the way that went down. And I think your film is so interesting because I have read in multiple books and a bunch of different articles, and I wasn't involved in this field back then, and so I'm kind of just going off of accounts that people have shared with it. And I think SCoPEx is viewed as this landmark incident around governance. And so when people are talking about governance of SAI or governance of how are we going to get to the point of doing outdoor field experiments so that we can learn more going beyond just the models for that, people look at it and basically everyone refers back to saying, well, we need to not repeat what happened with SCoPEx. And so what I found like fascinating for me was I went from literally in the evening watching like this conversation play out at a conference, and then I go back to my Airbnb and I'm watching the film explaining the history of why that was kind of a contentious interaction at the conference. So I would say for anyone who is curious about this, like your film is the place to see like what actually happened and how this played out, because I mean there were details that I wasn't aware of, and the fact that you follow along with them, like even just knowing the history of why did they end up going to Sweden and trying to do it there instead of in the US in the first place because of like the balloon manufacturing, and you get to see that in the film like that. Anyway, it's like we are incredibly fortunate that you had this concept idea as long ago as you did, and that you were there to film it, because I think it's really important historical cataloging of a field that's going to be like enormously relevant to the future.
Well, I mean, I feel really lucky to have been able to follow it along. I mean, it's just, I kind of, I'm like someone who's been like a little obsessive about climate change for a long time. And so for me to be able to sort of be along for the ride and to see what's happening at what I think is one of the more important sort of frontiers of research in this world, is a treat, and so, yeah, I mean, I appreciate that. Thank you. I think the understanding the context is really important. I mean, I think we live in a world where everything's in sound bites and snippets, and I mean, people I think probably said the same thing, or definitely said the same thing about the Spice Project, which meaning like let's not repeat that, right? And then you can just sort of see the choice to go to Sweden was really, like you said, was much more kind of procedural than anything else. It wasn't, I think that they were not. It was an opportunity for them because the balloon operator that they'd been working with which was in Arizona, basically was no longer able to help them. And there's like basically 3 balloon operators in the U.S. And I mean, all of this stuff is not in the film, but like I watched them go from one to the next, and there was a while when it seemed like they were going to work with a different operator, and then that fell through, and then over COVID, this opportunity opened up, and what you see in a headline is that it kind of sounds like these kind of callous researchers just like figured maybe this would go unnoticed and they could just do this easily there. But I saw them working really hard to do it in lots of different ways, and also the expectations that are placed on researchers in terms of community engagement and the way that you would ideally do these kinds of experiments that are so controversial can become really paralyzing in a lot of ways. These are, I mean, there's nothing. I'm not feeling sorry for David or Frank. Like they're both like doing just fine as people and researchers. This is hard work. As Liz says at the end, it's hard work. It's hard. So like you're engaging in something that's really hard. And then the question is just like, what level of engagement do you need and permission to do this kind of research, and how do you get that? And that's, I think, where their project kind of stumbled a little bit. But they also came up with some pretty formidable opposition that was well organized and had a different idea about the experiment. So,
So, what do you think you've learned in the process of doing this? Like, you've watched this field evolve from small meetings with just scientists to now something that is, much more significant and actually getting discussed at very high levels of policy circles and so on. And you were there. Was there anything that you changed your mind on, like as you were kind of watching this go, in terms of how you interpret the field or the subject matter or the people working on it or anything like that?
I mean, I would say one of the big factors in my thinking around this is time. And I think that is, I don't think you can separate the way that you think about climate change from time. And we're, without going too deep, we don't exist in geologic time as humans. We increasingly are more and more focused on, whether it's quarterly earnings or whatever beep our phone or buzz our phone is giving us. That's what we're really focused on. And as somebody who's just been really thinking about this for a long time, and watching the inevitable upward trajectory of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and hoping and working in different ways to try to raise awareness about that, and about what it means for us, for the planet, and all those kinds of things. And then having years just kind of flip by over and over again, and seeing that trajectory move upward inexorably, is just, that changes the way that I think about how we respond to this. And so when I first came to this topic back in 2009, I thought maybe this would, I just coming off making a film about ocean acidification, where I met Ken Caldeira, who actually kind of really helped shape the way that I think about these things. Because when you think about ocean acidification, you really have to be thinking in large geologic timescales. And so I was really wondering to myself, like, how do we get people to pay attention? And when I started hearing about solar geoengineering, it was like, this is just a couple of years after An Inconvenient Truth. So really everyone was talking about cutting emissions, which is still, but the most important step in all of this. But I was thinking, well, how, what can I do to get people to really pay attention? And when you start talking about making the planet more reflective, that's a what could possibly go wrong thought. That's a
Yes.
classic, why the hell would we do that?
Mm-hmm.
And then you start to tick off all of the things that could go wrong, that, like, whether they actually are real risks, or how those risks compare to the alternative of not doing them. That's a different question. But the idea that you could shift the monsoon, right? Which 2 billion people rely on, right? The idea that you could create droughts in some places, the idea that potentially more people would get lung cancer, like the geopolitics of it, which is even like the kind of craziest thing. When you just start thinking about those things, it really quickly becomes a really scary dystopian idea. And on first blush, certainly, and even just the idea of like the gall to think that we could deliberately change the temperature of the planet. I mean, that just cuts against so much of what is like in the pit of our stomachs or our hearts or heads. I mean, it's just crazy, right? And so I thought, well, what if I make a film and I tell people, like, if we don't cut emissions, this is like the break glass emergency that's coming, right? Maybe that'll get people to actually start to pay attention and to do the
Mm-hmm.
easy thing, which is cut emissions. Yeah, it's not easy, but honestly, like at this point, we're on the right path. Like we're almost on a glide path, and the war in Iran. Thank you, President Trump. That's going to really push things even further in the right direction, away from fossil fuels. So, um, that's all notwithstanding, like the time issue, when you come back to time, we didn't do it quickly enough. And, if you understand how long the residence time of carbon dioxide is in the atmosphere, and the fact that maybe we're plateauing, but we're putting something like 40, gigatons up every year still, even if we're starting to taper that and move that down and slowly starting to remove carbon, really slowly starting to remove
Mm-hmm.
carbon, that leaves us with decades of continuing with our foot to the floor of heating, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so as I spent 15 years making this and all of these things kind of came together, it really shifted the way that I thought about this, from like a kind of like a metaphor to scare people a little, scare them straight, um, into thinking like, I think this stuff is coming at us, solar geo, much, much faster than most people realize. Like, I think there's probably some major decisions that are going to get started to be made in the next few years. And the public has no clue. And if they do, they think they're talking about chemtrails, right? I mean, like,
Right.
nobody really has any idea about this. And so my role now really was to, as in my thinking, is like, I need to make a film that will get people to grapple with the reality of climate change and then start to think about decisions based on that. And that shifts the way that you think about these things.
Mm-hmm.
It shifts the old Overton window.
In the end of the film, you have some reactions from people who are either learning about this, or had they viewed parts of the film. I mean, getting to this point of what you were saying, it was like kind of like normie people who don't necessarily know about this or have this like science background or things like that. And I found that section really interesting, because I think I told you this when we had our very first introduction call. I had watched the film and came away from it thinking like, ooh, I don't think this field comes across looking very good in it. Combine, the sort of like combined stories of SCoPEx and then Make Sunsets. And I want to come back to Make Sunsets on this too. We had Luke on the podcast a few episodes ago. Um, and I've heard from you that that's maybe not how most people react to it. So you've been showing the film different locations. You've done some screenings I know of, at least in New York, and then you just did one in Palo Alto last week, and you have more coming. We'll talk about that. What has been the reaction like as people are learning about this via the film? What have they said?
Yeah, well, I think for people who are very sort of knowledgeable about this field and have been following it for a little while, and I think, if it's not an exaggeration, or I don't mean to cast aspersions, but I think you're in support of doing a lot of research into this, right? And like,
For sure, yeah, absolutely.
so, and I think if that's your position, then it's hard to watch the film, and it's a little cringy at times to see the caricature of Make Sunsets, and even David. There's kind of a big moment in the film that it complicates him and his character a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so I think I can imagine that, like, and I know from talking to people that for a lot of people who are the very, very, very small number of people in the world who are where you are in terms of having thought about this a lot and kind of come to where you are, that, it's like, to use the word cringy again, it's just a little cringe, like these guys are not like great salespeople for this concept, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, I think when I talk to average normies, as you said, who come to watch the film or who've watched the film, we've done focus groups. And so this is not just anecdotal information. Um, by and large, people come away from it exactly where I would like them to come away from it. in the position I would like and was hoping that they would, which is a somewhat more knowledgeable about what this idea is and what it isn't, and then also, you know, mostly open and eager to hear and to support more exploration and research in the understanding that there are a lot of issues that need to be thought carefully through and thought deeply about, and skeptical. Honestly, a lot of people. I mean, sure, there are some people who come away from this and are just like, well, that's I still think that's a terrible idea, right? Like we shouldn't even pursue that. But for the most part, people walk away from this experience of learning about this in what I think is a pretty even-handed film, deliberately so, and feel like, how could we not explore this more? Like how, like given the circumstances, what is it that the concerns that people have about research into this, and even to some extent limited field trials, that those concerns are real, but that they do not outweigh the need to understand this better. And so, and I think it's actually really important, critically important, the most important thing, that this film and that communications around this give people space to form their own opinions. Because without that, like, this is not a subject that you can effectively tell people what to think about. Like,
No.
nor should you. And
Right.
I think if there's any hint of that, people will just kind of dismiss it outright as, what it would be, which is advocacy. And this topic, it's not just about solar geoengineering, right? It's really, like, hopefully, I've referenced Inconvenient Truth before, but like helping people to start thinking about the stakes and the world that we live in, and the opportunities and the risks and the potentials and all of that in a different way. Like, fundamentally, how do we start thinking about stewarding this planet? Because that is what we're doing. Like, you cannot run from that. Like, I'm not going to like get into a debate with people about whether or not we can have an effect on the planet's climate or ecosystem. I mean, that's a ridiculous conversation. So then the question is, like, what effect are we having unintentionally? And then what does it mean to start thinking about having intentionality when it comes to these things? And that's what this story is about. And yeah, and I think I get that. Those people at the end of the film, that's a whole nother project that was actually research for another project, that's very much along these lines. But that project is entirely about how the average person approaches this topic. And those people actually had no idea, had not seen the film. I didn't even use the word solar geoengineering with them. I was just talking to people on the street to understand how they felt about about the climate and where we're heading, and whether or not what came to mind when I asked them about whether we should use technology to try to affect, the planet's climate and ecosystems. And so we were just generating, like, we were trying to feel people out. So,
well, that kind of leads into my next question, which is like, where do you go from here? I know, first off, like, I understand a little bit about the documentary, like, rollout process, but maybe explain a little bit about what you've been doing, and kind of what comes next. And then like, what are the next steps on this this mission of, like, helping educate people on this so that they can form their own opinions?
well, so we're kind of pursuing this like a lot of filmmakers are now. A lot of documentary filmmakers in particular, who are making films that have, sort of the critical thinking, social impact mission, or, conversation that they want to build around it. I don't know if it's surprising, but like Netflix and so forth are not particularly interested in films like this right now. They want celebrity and true crime categories. So it's actually okay, because we have this thing called social media, which allows us to talk to a lot of people. And what we're trying to do with the film, we're doing a lot of these screenings. We have a few different, like, kind of areas that we're really focusing on. A big one is going to be schools and universities, because this is really a topic that is really interesting, I think, to Gen Z people in particular, millennials and Gen Z, because they're inheriting this challenge, right? Like some of us, I don't know if you can tell, I'm not Gen Z, I'm Gen X, and even older folks have a somewhat different relationship to, the outcomes here. And so, and Gen Z has grown up, they're technophiles, they've grown up, in this world. And so, I'm not suggesting that like that's a way. I'm not trying to suggest that like they're just ready to take up solar geoengineering and run with it. But I think that they have a different understanding about the role of technology at this point. And so we're really focusing on a younger audience there with screenings and conversations. I do school visits and I go to classes and we talk about storytelling. We talk about all kinds of things. And that's going to really continue. We are also really focused on doing a tour with the film. We're planning that now for the fall, and what we're going to do is take the film to a bunch of states that have proposed legislation to ban solar geoengineering research and weather modification. And it's basically an excuse to go to really like the heartland of the country, to a bunch of places that are maybe a little purplish, but where we can really use those pieces of legislation, which are a kind of ridiculous legislation, to have a conversation about actually what's really happening and how we start to think about research and how we start to think about climate. And so, it's like let's lead off from the perspective that this is the solar geoengineering is not actually happening right now, at least not in the way that people might think it is. And we're not necessarily interested in influencing legislation in any way, but it's an opportunity because it's in the zeitgeist to really get people thinking and talking about this stuff. And so, of course, we do film. We're going to do film festivals, and we're building this all towards releasing the film sometime later this year, and we'll be doing a lot of work in the meantime to do that. We're also going to take it to London Climate Week in June and start to go internationally as well.
So for people who are listening or watching this podcast who are probably people who are relatively educated on this issue already, who haven't had a chance to see it, they how could they? You just mentioned like you'll be releasing it hopefully later this year, but where could they, I don't know, is there a place they could sign up for info about screenings and find one near them? And then I know that you have some distribution plans and maybe fundraising for that. So what's on that business side of things? Like how does that?
Yeah, I mean these films are in all this it's truly a labor of love. I mean we're fundraising all along the way to make the film and then to distribute it. So appreciate you asking. The easiest thing to do is go to our website, plancforcivilization.com, and you can sign up for our newsletter there. You can see where screenings are. We're also, we're on all the major platforms, social media, Instagram, so forth. Just you can find us there. All of that's linked to from our website. So we are doing screenings. We'll be doing several in Philadelphia, where I live, later this month. And then we'll be doing one in upstate New York in July, and then we'll be in London Climate Action Week, and they'll start to fill in with festivals. All that you can find on the website. But if you really want to see the film before too long, the best way to do that is going to be through our crowdfunding campaign, our Kickstarter that we do later this month, because one of the incentives will be just a download of the film, which is the quickest, easiest way to see it. But my hope is that it will be very widely available, end of 2026. But we've got to make sure that we have an audience out there. And well, I know we have an audience out there, but we need to build that audience. So,
yeah. Right. Yeah. It's all about platform building. I mean, that's why I'm doing this podcast, and you see this across the board. That's how the world works these days.
Yeah. So if you're a climate influencer, come talk to me.
Yeah. Have you heard from, well, I guess maybe they might not have had the opportunity to have learned about this yet, but have you gone on any other podcasts or shows or other like talk to some of these like climate communicator influencer people?
I've not spoken on a podcast with like a climate influencer per se, right? I've done a few smaller podcasts. We're just about to start kind of ramping up to try to get to some larger podcasts and so forth. But that whole climate communicator or climate influencer space, or the influencer space in general, is very new to me.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're working with some folks to help us kind of test those waters out. But I mean, I don't know. Have you?
Not really, no. I was just talking to someone yesterday about Substack and like, best practices for trying to grow the platform on Substack. And something I have noticed is it depends on the platform that you're on, but like one of the best ways to kind of grow it is by interacting with others and what they're doing. And on Substack, there's not a huge climate population. And this topic is so niche. It's like, already embedded multiple layers down from regular, like you might find a lot of stuff about energy transition and that kind of thing on there, but this is, so far removed from that. So no, it's a small field. It's super small. And the people who are interested in this are really interested in this. So it's very much in that like in the do you know the like the adoption curve of technology that gets used a lot. So this is still in that innovators space. We haven't even gotten to early adopters yet, in my opinion. But
Mm-hmm.
that actually leads to something that you and I have talked about before that I wanted to ask you about, which is what do you think is the role of storytelling? And I'm also curious about maybe fictional storytelling on this stuff as well. So I've long had this hypothesis that we need to see more depictions of these very large, impactful, complicated scenarios depicted in a way where we actually do like solve some of these governance challenges. We do figure out how to research this, and maybe we do deploy and see like positive results. Like I at our San Francisco Climate Week event that we hosted, the Stabilized Earth thing a couple weeks ago. At the end of the day, I got to interview Neil Stevenson about his book Termination Shock, which is about solar geoengineering. And I raised the point, like if we were to discover tomorrow that there was a giant asteroid heading towards Earth, I imagine people of a certain age, at least, might think of the plot of Armageddon or Deep Impact, because weirdly those two movies came out.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's hopefully not that one, because at least there are slightly better outcomes. Well, at least in Armageddon, not so much in Deep Impact. But like I imagine people might think about that, like, okay, is it possible to send a crew to the asteroid to try to do something about this? And I don't know that we have anything really aside from Termination Shock and Ministry for the Future. There's another really good novel about SAI called Veil by Elliot Pepper, which I would definitely recommend to anyone listening. But what do you think about that role of storytelling? I mean, you've been doing this, this is documentary. This is, you've got a perspective in the film, but you're trying to show like real events and real people. How do you think that compares to using fiction and storytelling in that way?
Well, I don't know if like Neil or Kim Stanley Robinson have optioned their projects. I don't know if
Yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I'd be curious to know if there was interest. I mean, a lot of things get optioned that never get made. But and they're dense. I mean, like Ministry for the Future is pretty dense as far as like, it's a deep dive kind of story. And so, I mean, I think the question I was actually just thinking the other day about like, how would you make a film about DAC, about direct air capture, and I mean, one of the things I was
to
thinking
that
about,
somehow.
what's that? Add stake.
Yeah, you have to add stakes and have like some sort of compelling
Yeah,
storyline.
I mean, I think like, right. I mean, to some extent, I mean, the one thought I was starting to have with that is that, you just make it like the sort of given circumstances of, I don't know if you've seen any of Landman, for instance. Did you watch
No,
Landman?
what is that? Mm-mm.
I can't really take it. I mean, it's like the guy who made Yellowstone,
Okay.
that series. He's done a lot of different series. Landman is set in the oil fields of the Permian, and
Oh, Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. I've seen trailers for this.
Billy Bob Thornton,
Yeah.
and
Mhm.
it's like, it's like set amongst this sort of intrigue and largesse and drama of oil operators, basically, and tapping into a lot of like kind of American themes, right? Of just largesse and all of this. And the one thing that I had to stop watching it because it's on a streaming platform, and the first commercial that every commercial break is like the American Petroleum Institute's propaganda, which I just
Yeah.
drives me crazy. And I mean, honestly, the series itself just feels like propaganda. It's crazy,
Mhm.
but what I was thinking is like, for instance, Oxy Petroleum, which bought David Keith's company, Carbon Engineering, and is building like the largest or one of the largest carbon capture, direct air capture facilities in the world. Like, just set a story in that world with people working on that project and then all of the stuff that kind of circles around it. Because I think if what you want to do is, and I know some people hate the N word, normalize. Like there's like there's a strong vein of people who don't want to normalize conversations about
Mhm.
everything from carbon removal, especially solar geoengineering, because they fear that like if people start thinking there's a quick fix and way out of this, then we're doomed because we'll stop cutting emissions and like those are understandable concerns. But I think that like if you tell stories that are not necessarily hyperbolic, exaggerated stories, but actually just place it in the world that we are living in, maybe heighten it a little bit. I mean, like, why not tell a compelling drama set on the they're in the implementation of a direct air capture project? Like it doesn't have to be, all the drama doesn't have to be centered around the technology itself, but it can be centered around the people and the humans who are trying to do something. I mean, that's what stories are about. It's about people
Mhm.
trying to do something and what happens and the obstacles they come up against, right?
Yeah, and there are some very interesting humans in those stories. One thing I think would be really compelling and interesting is about like ocean iron fertilization. I think they're trying to rebrand it these days to more like phytoplankton carbon, which sounds
I
a
don't know that
little.
that's going to be like rolling off the tongue any better, but yeah.
It's like,
Yeah.
yeah, I saw something the other day about nitrogen fixation. And anyway, the Russ George story from 2012, super compelling and interesting. Um, in some ways, oh yeah,
By the way, I made it's a side project. I made a short film about that. I went there in
really,
2014 before David and Frank announced their project. I went up there. I filmed with Chief Ken Ray and Jason McNamee and made a short film, thinking that was going to maybe be the way into this space, and it just didn't have the longevity. It didn't have the scope that I wanted. But
yeah.
probably during my crowdfunding campaign, I will probably offer that as an incentive to those who are interested. So there's
Oh,
an
okay. Well, you've intrigued me. You'll get me as a backer now just for that, because I
anyway.
definitely want
Sorry.
to see that.
Yeah,
Um,
no, that it's a really interesting story.
Cool. It is. I think it's you know, I was reading up on some of the details of that to refresh myself not that long ago, and um I read some interviews that Russ George did afterward, and it's like I know this type of like person so well. I've interacted with so many people like this who are kind of the older, um, you know, we really want to work on climate change. We don't necessarily have the patience for dealing with the niceties of political complexity or maybe a dismissal, kind of an attitude that like Make Sunsets has of like we should be taking action now, and consequences be damned. Let's move forward. Um, and it's really unfortunate that had, I mean, that basically put that field back by 10 years or more. And I think that that's relevant today because a lot of people have that concern about solar, like sunlight reflection. They don't, because we can't afford 10 years of delay anymore on this. We don't have that time left. But anyway, I do think that there would be a really cool, interesting fictional story, fictionalized story to tell about that. And then maybe like moving forward of how are we moving past that? What are we doing? There's got to be something about
Yeah.
on the high
I mean,
seas.
right. Yeah. Give me half a tanker of iron and I'll give you an ice age. Right.
Yeah.
That's the John Martin quote.
Uh-huh.
Um, yeah. I mean, I think yeah. I mean, we could talk about that for a while. I mean, Russ George, I think he's a little bit of a sketchy character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think this wasn't his first sort of like scheme around tapping into environmental
Nor his
concerns.
last.
Nor his last. Yeah, what is he? I don't know what he's been up to recently. So,
I'm not entirely sure, but I know he's been. I see him pop up occasionally in different listers and that kind of thing.
yeah. So, but yes, I mean, I think, and to me, actually, that's one of the areas that is. So I'm starting sort of insanely starting another project now in this space that's going to really look carefully at this question of like basically like how do you move forward with this as it's starting to move much more quickly and
With
you know
SRM.
with sunlight reflection with SRM, yeah, and like how do you start to understand like the fact that venture capital is moving into this space now
Mm-hmm.
is a really tricky development. I mean, to some extent, that's what makes sunsets is it's venture capital, but that's like performance art. Like I mean,
I agree.
sorry, Luke, and actually not sorry, Luke, because Luke knows what he's doing. Like this is not there. I don't think Luke expects like it's certainly not what the way they're doing it now to be any sort of like global cooling solution. Although I don't know, actually, he may have some ideas about how that would work, but really we're talking about more sort of like ambitious, well-funded systems thinking, researchers and entrepreneurs really who are moving into the space. And we had this panel conversation in Palo Alto, which was I sort of titled it, slow science or move fast. And right now, that's kind of the dichotomy that we have, which is we have the very, very paced, slow science of academia, and to some extent now, and with like ARIA and others, we have more money moving into R&D in the field and field research and field experiments. But on the other hand, you also have some sort of really well funded like companies like Stardust
Mm-hmm.
Solutions, who are like unabashedly moving to develop a deployment system essentially that is like
Mm-hmm.
gate checked along the way and has all kinds of safety protocols in mind, but is like declarative. They're trying to have something together in the next few years to hand off to a government. And and like the role that the way that people perceive venture and profit at this point in this field, I think is really critical. And I understand why different people will take money from for-profit money to investment money to do this. There are also others like Reflective that are philanthropic, and that's really important to them. And so it's really, to me, that's where the rubber hits the road. And like Russ George, I mean, he's a marketer, like he's a hype man, really. And I think that's where a lot of the risk comes in, because you can really sell a story around this stuff to certain people. And I think like, direct air capture and carbon removal suffered mightily from this too. I mean, I think a lot of people jumped into that space with a lot of different ideas in carbon utilization. Like there's a real incentive to be able to market what you're doing really well. And there's a lot less of an incentive, especially in solar geoengineering, to be able to actually prove what you're doing, and to prove it safely.
Yeah. Well, I would actually, I don't know. I might disagree on that. I think there's actually a huge incentive there. And from my conversations with Stardust, I actually think that one of the things that they're doing is relatively interesting, which is kind of working backwards from the question of, okay, if we are going to do this, we assume that governments of the world are going to want to have really good tracking and monitoring in place. Like we want to know as much as possible, like what impacts are being had, which maybe gets you closer to having some semblance of ability to understand attribution problems, which I think is an interesting approach. I don't know if what they're doing is going to work there, and I don't know if it's the right approach, but I find it interesting and compelling. And I at least am glad that there are people thinking about that kind of engineering challenge and trying to solve that. But it's super messy, and there are a lot of people who don't like that kind of approach, and there are lots of different opinions on this. I think one of the things that's really interesting is that this field is so small that, like, I mean, you or I could rattle off the names of all of the individuals who are working on this and what their opinions are on this. And, we could very easily like plot out on a map the different perspectives that people have on this. And I don't think that that's the case, in comparing that to carbon removal. I don't think that that's really the case anymore, because that field is so much larger. There's so many companies, there's so many people, there's so many different projects, for profit, nonprofit, billions and billions of dollars coming in. And I think that's a good thing in some ways. And in this like climate stabilization interventions field, it's a lot of tyranny of small differences between people. Like, ultimately, all of us are interested and curious about this because we recognize that it's too hot, it's getting hotter, there are some really bad consequences that are harming a lot of people, and we would like to do something about that in the time that we have to do about it. And like, there's a lot that we agree on values wise, and then you get these like very complicated internecine academic arguments going back and forth.
Yep. I mean, I think, right. I mean, it's like, it's kind of like scrambling for the crumbs in a way.
Mm-hmm.
It's direct air cap. I mean, I think I don't think I was being particularly or clear, articulate about what I meant, which is just that I think what's most important is to be able to prove what you're doing and to be able to build trust around that. Right.
Yeah.
And
Yes, absolutely.
I saw what happened with like carbon offsets. Like, it was just a disaster, right? Like, the verification was not there. People were double counting, they were triple counting, they were doing all kinds of
Right.
things.
Yeah. I mean, that
Yeah.
was what my company was trying to. It's funny because we were in 2017 looking at the carbon offsets field and saying, like, oh my goodness, there's like so much low hanging fruit here that you could solve with technology to account for the like double counting and the incentives for fraud and all of that. And it's an ongoing existing challenge to try to deal with that. And when you start talking about diffuse particles in the stratosphere, it's even more insanely complicated.
Yeah, and it's like, I mean, it's one thing with like direct air capture, say, where David has said this and says it in the film, where like all you want to do is be able to count. Like, you need to be able to count the numbers, right? Like, how much
Mm-hmm.
energy do you take to take how much carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, and where do you put that carbon dioxide? And that's actually not terribly challenging to account for. If you have transparency and so forth, and someone's actually trying to do it. But with something like in that sense, like, as soon as the numbers come to bear, the marketing is just marketing. But like, there's a lot of hype cycle stuff around carbon utilization, and you really got to like understand what people are saying they're doing and what they're actually doing. Is it actually, like, does it matter to use direct air capture to create carbonation? Like, well, maybe not, or maybe it does. If you're not taking more hydrocarbons out of the ground in order to create that, then like, yes. But if you're, so anyhow, with
And
solar
in a
geo.
lot of cases, the only way that we can know is to try it. Like, I remember in the very, very early days of carbon removal, people talking about that kind of use case. And we'd say, okay, well, okay, but you're not actually removing CO2 from the atmosphere. It's going to cycle back in as soon as someone drinks that beverage and then burps,
Yeah.
right? So, but is that useful in terms of building some sort of like revenue stream that can be used for funding R&D? And maybe yes, maybe not, but the only way that you can find out is by running that experiment.
Right now, like, for instance, a lot of the carbon dioxide that goes into drinks might be coming from hydrocarbons that are already inevitably being taken out of the ground, and so it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't really do much. It's going to go up there anyways. But in the future, it may be 30, 40 years from now, if we're all of a sudden don't have that readily available stream of carbon dioxide because we've really decarbonized. We still want beer, like, like, it's got to come from somewhere. And so if at that point you've got a nice little unit that can generate carbon dioxide for you, then it doesn't matter so much that you're recycling it if you're not using a lot of energy to do it.
Oh yeah, I mean, that's a long time bugaboo for me, or bugbear for me, of like when thinking about carbon removal, and people talk a lot about the challenges of permanence and durability and the different types of methods for drawdown and sequestration. And I've always looked at it like, look, if we're going to be building like a multi-trillion-dollar industry that's capable of removing massive amounts of CO2 from the air, you're not just going to shut it down when we reach 350 parts per million. Like that, in the same way that you can't just shut down the oil industry right now. Like it'll be too far embedded across the entire global economy. So we're always like, once we start removing CO2 and managing the carbon cycle, we're going to do that forever. And so yes, it will just become the new normal that we are using these tools for extracting it and using it in those.
The oil industry will have the carbon removal industry, and they'll be making jet fuel and all kinds of other tasty treats.
Yeah. Like we're very unlikely to ever move away from liquid hydrocarbons. It's just a matter of where are they coming from and where are we sourcing it from? Are we recycling it or are we extracting it?
That's a next level conversation, right? I mean, like, you got, yeah. So, but I mean, I think it just, to come back to solar geoengineering or sunlight reflection, it's like, yeah, I mean, like, there's going to be it's one thing to like visualize taking carbon dioxide out of the air, turning it into some sort of a gas or a solid, and then using it for something like that and counting that along the way. We could have the science down to a T with solar geoengineering. You could have like isotopic markers on like the particles that you're putting up there to track where they are and to see how diffuse they are and to really measure everything. There's still going to be a big piece of this that is just trust.
Yes.
And to me, like, or it's just going to get rammed down everybody's throats by a government, right? By governments. Like that's probably even more likely. But like, I mean, who knows?
But hopefully there's trust built up there.
I mean, there has to be trust in some way in this for it to work. And so I think, like, as much as, like Stardust Solutions, I think my understanding is going about this about as right as you would in their position in terms of the way that they're thinking about it. But that doesn't change a lot of things about them, which in this moment, being an Israeli company of former nuclear scientists funded by Silicon Valley tech billionaires whose stated goal is to change the planet's temperature and accidentally, by the way, name themselves after, the Empire's plan to build the Death Star. Like that, it just, to me, like, this is nothing about them. It's just the world we live in. And so you can't subtract that from the equation.
No, you really can't. And I think that Stardust is also interesting too, because like the field is in some ways acting as if they're not really there. But as you were saying earlier, like it's forcing the question, and it's forcing us to like rapidly grapple with, how are we going to deal with liability? How are we going to deal with contracting? How are we going to deal with this international governance stuff? Like it all has to happen at the same time. And we're just going to have to muddle our way through it, because there's no other choice. These forces are moving, and no individual or human can stop them, but we can try to redirect them as much as we can.
Yeah, I mean, right. I think, I don't think there's nothing anyone can do to slow down this train right now. Some people would like to, I think it's I mean, it's just, it's partly about the ambition of the people in the field, and ambition in a positive way to try to make a difference. Because I do genuinely believe that everyone I've met in this field is in it really ultimately for the right reasons. Nobody is a climate denier. Like no one I've met is a climate denier who's in this field at all. In fact, they all come to this kind of as a career last resort after having sort of like figured out that there's nothing else where they can contribute. And so, I think it's where, how do we play, all of us, the most useful, responsible role in helping a little bit to shape this towards something that's, the least harmful and the most beneficial, right? It's pretty easy to imagine how harmful this could be, even if the harm is that it gets developed in a way where it creates that backlash you were talking about, and it shuts down exploration. Because I mean, that's the other thing that I think is in the background of everything we've been talking about, which is just in what I really want this film to help do, which is as we bring it out into the world, and as this conversation moves into the world, that it hopefully can spark that sense of imagination and creativity and really agency that I think we lose when we understand the how dire the situation is. And you know, it's like it's really easy to just want to find a cabin in the woods and, you know, get a bunch of flour and rice and guns and you know, and so I think it's really important that we don't dismiss things out of hand, even though they're super complicated, right?
Yeah.
It's a complicated world. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that's a good spot to wrap up. The film is Plan C for Civilization. That's also the website, plancforcivilization.com. You've got the crowdfund raise coming out very soon. So if you want to, if you're not going to be at one of the screenings in the future, that is the way to get to see the film. I highly recommend it. I learned a lot. It was really entertaining. And thanks for coming on, Ben. I'm looking forward to seeing everything that you continue to do with this going forward.
Thanks for having me. This is a fun conversation.
Agree. All right. Bye.